introductory remarks. Happy Thursday to everyone. I'm pleased to introduce my respected colleague, Aimé Iglesias Lukin, the Director and Chief Curator of Visual Arts at the American Societies in New York City. I have the honor of collaborating with Aimé over the past decade in my capacity as founder of the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, or ISLAA for short. I know firsthand that Aimé is a thoughtful, sharp curator with a talent for bringing artists and their stories out of the margins and into the spotlight. Ulises Carrión offers a timely example of Aimé's vision in action. It was my privilege to work with her on The Big Monster, 2019, last year, the exhibition that Aimé curated at ISLAA, and the subject of her talk tonight. Carrión's work survived due to the painstaking labor of the artist's friends and collaborators, who kept his papers intact after his ultimately death in 1989. They hope that one day, this artist from Mexico will receive the attention he deserved. That time has come. On a related note, I want to take a moment to plug Aimé's recent essay in a monograph she edited on Feliciano Centurion, a radical queer artist from Paraguay who is the subject of a solo show that just closed at the American Society. ISLAA is thrilled that we could support a wonderful publication that introduces Centurion to new audiences. Thank you, Aimé, for presenting artists like Carrión and Centurion in a context worthy of their importance to Latin American cultural production. Finally, I want to thank my friend Jesus Fuenmayor, María Paula Varela, and the University of Florida for staging Ulises Carrión Postmaster. We at ISLAA love to see Ulises Carrión archives being shared with the public. Thank you all for attending, and please join me in giving Aimé a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you so much, Maria Paula, for inviting me, and to Jesus. It's a pleasure to be talking today. I joined this conversation not as an specialist on Carrión, but which I'm not, and there are other ones out there that have written dissertations and books about him, but as somebody who found his work through, researching archives. And that's something that I did working with Ariel at ISLAA. I think this is important to point out because when Ariel started his exhibition program, when ISLAA started an exhibition programs in their space in the Upper East Side in New York, they invited me to curate the first exhibition, and I thought that Carrión was the perfect example of an artist that worked with artworks that go around the idea of the archive, right? What we're going to see, if you had a chance to see the exhibition in the museum, or if you know about Carrión's work and in the works I'm going to be presenting, which actually I can put them now. Give me 1 second. It's an artist that conceived his artworks as research and archives of his practice, archives of his acquaintances. In some cases, he did work about his friends in Amsterdam, where he lived, and about an artist that was trying to archive and to classify artistic practice through communication with others. That was a reason to do the exhibition at ISLAA. ISLAA is an archive on itself. ISLAA has been working in promoting Latin American art archives for a very long time, and they have a very important mission doing this. So it was important to do that. When we conceived this exhibition, we had what is called The Big Monster, which is a series of projects that Carrión did, including up to 10 different projects. Some of them are magazines and many of them are mail art. The reason why Carrión called this The Big Monster has to do with a manifesto that he wrote in which he spoke about the necessity to explore the very recent history of mail art. He does this manifesto in the mid-70s when mail art had just started as an international movement of exchanging between artists a few years before. And he decides that it's time to make a history of the movement and to classify the movement and to understand how it had grown. So he, in this manifesto, he, for example, talks about, mail projects that involve different senders, ones that involve like the return of an instruction. So you would send an instruction, Carrión would send an instruction to colleagues and friends and receive pieces in return. And so there's a whole set of different classifications. And what he found in his research is that there's a limit to the possibilities of mail art, and that mail art was knocking at the doors of the big monster. And the big monster was the postal system. We're going to see in a minute a slide in which I can show you a project in which he tries to overcome the big monster as a limit. But basically, I mean, that's why the show is called The Big Monster. An important thing about the images that you're seeing, I'm going to give a quick overview of how the installation looked at ISLAA, is that, as you can see, the pieces were shown in plastic bags. These are not simply plastic bags, but these are archival plastic bags. So we were trying to use the same type of materials that you would use to store these in an archive. And the reason to put most of the works in the wall and not in vitrines was precisely to transgress the traditional system through which in art exhibitions, archives are presented in vitrines horizontally. And while you see the objects in, the artworks in the wall. These archives and these objects of mail art are artworks on themselves. That was Carrión's thinking. That was the mail art proposal, to conceive these as artworks. No matter whether they were multiple, no matter whether they had a humble material like an envelope, like we can see in this photo. So to present them in the exhibition wall of ISLAA Space was also trying to respect and highlight the role that the archive had for Carrión, which was precisely to represent this barrier in between the art object and the research document. Some of the projects that were shown in the exhibition had a regular format. That is, for example, the pieces that you can see here on the left, or this work over here, which are return projects. That means that, as I mentioned before, these were projects that Carrión would, this in this case, for example, these were postcards that Carrión sent to colleagues, and they would send a return response, and this is called the definitions of art, and is a piece that has over 300 responses. In most cases, responses that respect the original postcard format, like in this one here. But some people responded with letters, like the case here of this letter by Regina Silveira. Others responded with larger versions. Others responded to a newspaper clipping that he also published in a newspaper and sent that back with their definition of art. So what we see is a tension also in between regularity, like in these pieces, and these ones, the envelopes, and works that have to do precisely with the opposite, the complete irregularity. Like we see, for example, in this project, right? So we try to respect that in the installation also by positioning the pieces either in the form of a very organized grill, like what you see here in these postcards, or in very irregular form, like we did in this salon installation that we did for this project. That's a little bit the overview of the curatorial reasoning behind this. And this project over here that you can see on the left is the EAMIS, the Erratic Art International Mail Service. And this is the project that Carrión develops to precisely try to go beyond the big monster being the postal service. For him, the postal service was a monster or a limit because it's linked to bureaucracy, to government, and to power. And as such was in danger of censorship all the time. He actually develops this project at the same time that mail artists that he was friends with, like Clemente Padín and Caravaggio in Uruguay, are in jail because of their mail art projects. And he organizes with colleagues a denunciation campaign in this magazine that they publish, right, in the Ephemera magazine, which was a magazine of mail art. So the need to go beyond the postal service was not just a conceptual, theoretical, let's say, avant-garde-ish gesture on his end, but it was also a real necessity in times of harsh dictatorships in Eastern Europe and in Latin America, where there was a very strong network of mail artists participating with artists in the US, especially in San Francisco and New York, in Europe, and in these two regions. So this network was very active, and many of the names that we see in this exhibition are actually pieces that are part of Carrión's project, but are responses by him. So that's a little bit the general presentation of the work, but I don't want to go too much into detail into the pieces so that I give a chance to Maria Paula to explain her exhibition also. But I'm happy to come back to this in more detail if there are any questions, and I'm happy to describe the projects if you prefer.
Thank you so much. And I have a lot of questions I want to ask you about your experience curating, and I welcome everyone in the audience to also put their questions in the chat so that we can make this a broader conversation. So my first question for you was regarding working with an archive. What were some of the challenges or some of the pleasant surprises that you had working so closely with such a large archive for this exhibition?
Well, I mean, the traditional challenges of the archives in general, not in this case, just to mark the difference, I would say that you have a lot of raw information that artists have that they didn't necessarily meant to share, and that they might be incomplete thoughts, and they might be, ideas that were not accomplished or that were accomplished differently. They can explain or even confuse the understanding of an artwork. This is for a traditional archive of an art. I would say that in the case of Ulises Carrión is very different, because what we do know about Carrión is that he was an obsessive archivist himself. This archive, the archive of the Big Monster, is very much depurated and very much an archive of mail art projects. It's not his personal archive. So it contains different challenges, right? I mean, it's more clean and depurated and prepared, it contains projects and artworks and magazines that he did, this archive, but the contents are already organized and it was extremely well classified. So that was very easy. Mm-hmm. I would say that the challenge was how to present it in the shape of an exhibition, whether you wanted to present it as, as an artwork, or if, traditionally you would present it as sometimes it is shown in a vitrine or in a folder, or a binder. for this specific show, it was very important to put the pieces on the wall and to make a counter gesture of present them as artworks, which is something that other museums have done in the past. It's not a novelty that we did, but it was very important for us that all the works were in the walls. And that allowed to make an emphatic gesture about the presence of these pieces like that. That also involved that it was impossible to show all of the project, right? For example, this piece over here, it's a piece that has, I think, almost 400 returns, and we just did a selection. And in doing that selection, because of the constraints of time when you're making an exhibition, we tried to make sure, we had some basic, criteria, but we had to decide which pieces from this project to show. And we combine different criteria. We tried to include famous artists that people would recognize on the signature, or that we could tell people this was done by such person. Artists that came from Latin America, because ISLAA is an archive of Latin art, so it's important to include names that show the networks that Carrión had with the continent. And also artists that were part of the New York conceptual art scene, because this was an exhibition happening in New York. So, very basic criteria, but things that you might not think about until you're faced with the necessity of doing a selection. We also, that was like the basic selection in terms of names, but that was not the main criteria. I would say the main criteria was to try to show the most possible variety of responses, so that we could show the scope to which artists took these instructions sent by Carrión and responded to it in such creative ways. I didn't want it to show just the best names. I wanted to show also the most creative and interesting ones. So let me see. I could show, I don't know if we can go back to sharing images, but I could show a few more.
Absolutely.
Examples.
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting what you said about how the fact that he was an obsessive archivist informed the exhibition per se, and that your goal as a curator was really to show the richness of that archive, which I find is a great policy to have when you're curating an exhibition like that. And as I said, I think my internet is working now. I can hear you clearly. But you got cut off right when you asked me what my approach to the exhibition was. So I'm going to take this moment to tell you a little bit about that. And for me, there was so little written about Carrión. Your exhibition was very much a model for that. And I really appreciated something you wrote in your text about Carrión being a cultural agitator. And that was something that I hope you can talk a little more about, perhaps while you show the images. And so I took sort of that foundation from your exhibition and thought a lot more about the collective dialogues that I thought he had created with other human beings, and how his status as an artist becomes somewhat questioned when he comes up with the idea, but really delegates working to all the participants, his friends and colleagues, to whom he sent the postal orders to, and from whom he then received them. And that's sort of where I came with the title, that postmaster title, that postmastery, but at the same time playing that figure of the postmaster from Aimé. So please share some of those rich sort of artworks that you wanted to show and you emphasize in your exhibition. I think we would be greatly
Yes, so I hope it's not, I'm gonna share them like this. I wasn't planning to share, but so, these are some of the scope of the type of responses we have. So this is a piece we're just commenting on. So you had people, so the way this works is that this piece of paper that you see here was, had a definition of mail art and a series of instructions for people to return the lower part of it reconstructed. So Carrión broke it into pieces and mailed it to the guests, the participant guests, into pieces, and they had to reconstruct it. The funny thing is that, for example, Guillermo Deisler, a super important mail artist and conceptual artist for Chile, he returned it, and what they all would find is that there was always a missing piece, right? So everybody responded to this in very different ways. Some responded like burning and bagging the pieces, like here. Some responded with, piercing the pieces into this typical like paper holder, putting it in bottles with objects, and we have, somebody like classify the pieces and interpret each section into a little like acrylic folder. And we even have this beautiful response, which is probably the most fun one, which is the fish with a little piece of paper and these matchboxes where you are like in a way invited to burn it, and then you have the burned pieces. So you have all these responses, that in terms of the objects, and then this is the AMIS project, but you have all this variety of things. Somebody put a Polaroid. But then going to your question or comment about Carrión being a cultural agitator, I think it's very important to have in mind that Carrión was above anything a poet, right? And he is working on visual arts like, modern and avant-garde poets do, deconstructing language. So unlike a lot of other artists, like, conceptual artists from the 1960s in the US, his education and his formation is that of a writer, a linguist, and a poet. And his emphasis on the idea of the deconstruction of language, is very much fed into that tradition. I think, and the second important point about that is that he was a migrant artist. For me, that's a fundamental aspect about Carrión. In my own research, I work a lot about the role of migration in artists and how that affects their production. And I think that Carrión is part of, a legacy of artists that because of their migration, they are forced to see things in multiple ways, and they're forced to work with multiple languages, especially Carrión, who moved into Amsterdam. I'll explain a little bit about his biography in a second, but I want to retain this idea because there's something beautiful that Luis Kamnitzer said about his position as a migrant artist in the interview book published by the Cisneros collection. And he says that being a migrant artist and working with two different languages is like swimming and seeing yourself swim from outside the pool at the same time. You are able to be doing something and at the same time seeing it from beyond. There is a distance which he shockingly says that is almost schizophrenic, which is very strategic, and that it's something that most migrant artists that have to change language, especially if you have to change language like Carrión or Kamnitzer had to do, are forced to do. Because the same way, like in everyday life, we Spanish speakers or anybody who migrated to the US, you might notice and denaturalize certain expressions that I take for granted in language because you realize what the word means. So he had that extra element. And as a migrant artist, I think that there's a second characteristic that is usually common to migrant artists, which is the necessity of a network, right? You are somebody who left your home country and you are forced to make new acquaintances and forced to form new communities. And that's very much the case with Carrión. And Carrión did, his whole work is about community. He created a whole career out of making community through these mail art networks. And a lot of his performance work or his video work that is not necessarily done in the media of mail art, which is fantastic. And I hope that anybody interested in Carrión has a possibility to research that also. even those works have to do with the idea of community in the Netherlands, right? Obviously, mail art is about creating connections. Mail art is about creating exchanges in between artists beyond geography. So it's about community on itself as a media. But Carrión's interest in community goes beyond that. One of his most famous pieces is El Rumor, the gossip research, which is like a socio-anthropological research in the shape of the final result is a video, but he basically says a fake rumor on the Netherlands cultural art scene through friends and starts tracking the way that the rumor rotates and mutates until it becomes something much bigger than it can be handled, and it gets completely deformed. And he does the study of how that rumor changes through time and through people. So I think those are very important aspects. So a little bit about Carrión's life, if you want me to say, just because maybe.
Absolutely.
So Carrión, he was born in Mexico. I'll make it very short because anybody can Google it. But basically, he was born in Mexico. He studied literature and linguistics, and he goes to the UK first to do a postgraduate degree, a master's degree. And then he keeps studying in Germany, and then he spends some time in Spain, but finally he settles in the Netherlands. And there he establishes, and he is in touch with other artists doing poetry and conceptual art, and he starts getting interested in doing books and visual products. And little by little, he starts getting more interested in visual arts. It's also a time in which, the barriers in between literature and visual arts are very much broken. Even more than now, I would say. We're talking about the 1960s, and the idea of art and life trying to be merged also led to a merge of disciplines, of professional disciplines. And he creates Other Books and So, which is a bookstore of independent books that he edits and that he gets from all over the world, but also a community space and also an art center. So everything he did had to do with this idea of forming community.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's one of the themes I definitely wanted to home in on. And I find what you said about the multiplicity of immigrant artists or artists who leave their home countries is so compelling and is very much there. It's present in the archive, because there are, in all the postcards, there are so many different languages and just so many different people communicating such different things. And I think that's one of the most touching aspects of Carrión's archive. And I think that those human connections that are there, sort of physically implanted on those postcards, are so touching. And we had actually, for this exhibition, we actually had a very interesting experience where, while I was looking at all the images one by one, I noticed that in Robin Marda, there was a postcard that had the same last name as one of my classmates at UF.
Oh, I love it.
I said, well, that's interesting. So I sent it to my classmate. And it turned out that the people who had sent that postcard were actually his parents. And he had no idea that they had had contact with Ulises Carrión. So the fact that these relationships are sort of encapsulated in those postcards today, and we have the ability to reveal them, is really fascinating. And it makes sort of the archive so human in a way. And that was amazing. That was just such a beautiful.
Lovely. Were you able to exhibit that piece?
Yes, it's there. It's there, and it's for everyone to see. Yeah.
I know people are seeing the work right now, but I have it in screening if you want to share it. But yes, here is Robin Marda, and it's a failed project in a way. And please correct me, Maria, if I'm wrong, because it's a project in which he invited. There's some instructions here in which he invites anybody to respond to this postcard in any way they want, if they are called either Rob or Marta, or any of the variations in any language of the names Robert and Marta. And he wanted to do like an anthropological research about that. This is the instruction. And this is a lot of people that responded with that and, wanting to participate. And and what happened to him is that a lot of the people that answered, they were not called Robert or Bob or Martha or any variation of the name. They just were, interested in knowing more about the project. So for our iteration, for the sake of space, we just selected a few Robs and a few Marthas, and that was it. But that failure, if you like, is also part of the artwork, and that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wanted to know, so I asked Dr. Johanna Goss this when I had a talk with her, and I've been very curious to know what you think about the following. In this year specifically, there was an enormous boom of mail art where people started sending things to each other in a world that is so electronically driven. And I wanted to know, what do you make of that? What conclusions can you draw from this recent flourishing of mail art?
I don't know. I think, it's natural. I think communication became very necessary with the lockdown and the pandemic. And the need to communicate is something that, obviously to communicate through postal card and to communicate through paper, it becomes important. Materiality becomes important with like the excessive amount of like screen time that we're having to have. So that's very obvious. I also hope, but I don't know, that this is not one of now that we've been a few months into the pandemic, we also see that the pandemic a little bit had its trends, right? So there was a moment in which we were all baking. Then there was a moment in which we were buying plants. And then there was, there's like stages in the pandemic, the moment where everybody ran to buy a bike, because we thought we would never take the subway ever again, at least in New York, it depends on the city. But so I hope it stays, I don't know. I think it's beyond our control. But I think that no matter what is the media, the important thing is that it's about creating community. I wonder if Carrión was alive now, if he would use paper or if he would use the internet,
Right.
I have a feeling that he wouldn't mind the virtuality, A lot is, it's a very material work, and a lot is about materiality. But they didn't have the option, I think that going back to the postal service is something that for us became important. And also for political reasons with the elections, the postal service became one of the main, discussions in the USA. But yeah, I hope it stays. There's something beautiful about the idea, the expectation of not knowing what people are going to send, the anxiety of knowing that other people responded something different, and that the only chance you're going to have to see what other responded is when Carrión or whoever would show all this together,
Right. Yeah, it's true. There is something very beautiful about analog media.
Yeah,
for sure.
But I think that's also a nostalgia that we had that they didn't have,
Right.
I don't think that, for us it's nostalgia. For them, it was the way to communicate, Until quite recently, people would send mail all the time.
Absolutely. And perhaps most especially people who lived abroad and wanted to communicate with their friends and family back home. So there's that sort of additional layer.
About a time in which even to make an international phone call was too expensive. One thing
right.
Latin American artists living in New York did, which is something every dissertation, they would have, there was a whole system of hacked public booth phone telephones that people would know about, in which you could go and pay a little bit to let somebody for somebody to let you use that hacked phone, in which you could call for cheaper or for free abroad.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the time we're talking about, up until the 80s. I mean, when I was a young girl in the 1990s, making an international phone call was expensive.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
We have a question from the chat. I'm going to pull it up. Was Carrión using international postal services at the same time he was trying to subvert them, or was he operating his project outside of them somehow?
Oh, I think, thank you, Mark, for your question, because I think that's something that I started explaining and I didn't finish. So you're giving me a chance to explain it right now, because I started talking about the AMIS. If you give me 1 second, I would love to illustrate my response, because it's such a beautiful project also. What you see here on the left on close up here is the AMIS service. This is the alternative postal service that Carrión creates to try to subvert the mail the mail system. And basically what it is something that we've been doing forever, especially if you live in Latin America, where the mail service is just bad. Basically, it's you ask somebody the favor to take something for you. So, as simple as that. So what Carrión does is like he creates this logo and this like pretty like postal bag, kind of like replicating what postal services would do, what a mailman would have, and invite people to send artworks and whatever they wanted to each other through this service. But he had one condition, and this is where you see that Carrión was thinking about archives all the time. He asked people to do 2 copies of most of these objects. One would be sent to, the destination, and the other one would be kept on the AMIS archive. He creates a manifesto and a series of rules for AMIS, but it was clearly an art project that, which he like claims to have found a way to avoid the postal service by, just basically asking people, could you send this package when you go there, and like give it to somebody. So it was like hand by hand, something that has existed all throughout history. But something also to have in mind is that he wasn't that strict about it, and he was using the mail service on the side also. He just created like this creative, like artistic alternative, but it's not like he was, not using the mail. And he goes back to use the mail in most of his other projects in the future also.
Perfect. Jesus had a question. I think he wants to put it in the chat, but I will read it for you. When we did the Obregón archive at the University Gallery last year, we decided to do the opposite that you did with Carrión's Big Monster. We specifically wanted to show the works in vitrines or cabinets, avoiding the walls, because in that way we would emphasize the archival status of the works. We exhibited more than 300 works inside 54 vitrines. For us, it was more about creating a critical approach to the relation between the archive and the white cube. It seems to me that your approach implies something else. But he didn't finish the question. But could you comment a little more about the choice of the walls in contraposition with the choice of the vitrines?
Well, I think it's probably the same goal that Jesus had with his Obregón project, which is beautiful, and I've seen. But it's, it's the same approach through the opposite strategy. It's just emphasizing the archival quality of these projects. I think that for me, at least, because Carrión is an artist that works so much with archives, much more with archives than Obregón, for me, it was necessary to do it Chester, because the traditional way in which Carrión works had been shown before in museums, had been in vitrine. I needed to do the opposite gesture to emphasize the tension in between the archive and the artwork of the traditional white cube. But I mean, in the case of Obregón, it would be the opposite, and I understand why he needed to do, show them as archive. So yeah.
Hold on, I have the complete question, so I will read it to you. It seems to me that your approach implies leaving aside questions about the status of the works in the exhibition, as if prompting its artistic status will keep alive the avant-garde edge of Carrión's archive. In a way, I think your approach promotes an idea that those radical gestures of the 60s and 70s still have some potential for a transformation of the institution. My approach to the archive is more skeptical, like Obregón was, to this kind of transformations. Do you think that 1960s and 1970s avant-garde practices have some kind of transformative potential? How is that transformative faith reflected in exhibition making today? That's a great question, Jesus.
I don't know. I think you're assuming that I think that the archive has radical, possibilities, which I don't necessarily think. I think nothing has necessarily a radical possibility. So there's a few assumptions there. Also, as I said, I think it's a very different case because in the Obregón case, you're talking about an artist who was usually shown in the wall and you're taking him to the vitrine, which makes absolute sense as a gesture to, be able to emphasize, the edgy quality of these artworks as archive and artworks, which is very clear in Obregón, of course. So you need to go in that direction to do that. I felt that for Carrión, we need to go the opposite way because he had been shown so much as the pieces had been shown so much as an archive. Also, Carrión showed his works like this. What we are doing, the type of install that we did is very similar to what Carrión would do in his space in other books and so. So some of the works were shown in a table, but most of them, especially when he had exhibitions, were covering the walls, either in a grid or salon style, depending on the project and its shape. So it had to do, with, reconstructing an historical. To be completely honest, that's something that I discovered after going through books and archives and seeing help of the installing assistant at ISLAA. He had found some pictures that I hadn't seen. Like I had only seen 1 or 2 pictures of how he installed it, and he found more. So there we confirmed that what I was thinking ahead was something that Carrión had done. But I think it works both theoretically and that it works also, as an historical reconstruction of what he was doing, which is something we discovered after.
Right. So it's a twofold approach. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then with regards to the radical potential of the 1960s, I don't know. I think it's fun. I don't think it's my role to judge so much the intentions of the author. I don't feel like an artwork is necessarily the intention of the artist at the time that he made it only. Obviously, Carrión had intentions of making his work radical, of being a cultural agitator, of subverting the systems of distribution, production, and what an artwork was or not. But I think that artworks have an afterlife that goes beyond the artist's intention, and I think that they, they also have formal qualities. They also are beautiful, they're interesting, they are a window into a previous time, what we were saying before about this time in which the mail was so important and in which communication happened through other ways. So yeah, I think this is a show of art history also. This is not a contemporary art, it's recent art history, but it's still art history. So yeah, I don't know if I responded correctly.
No, I think you absolutely did. Thank you. And I think if there are no more questions, that we are at time. And I wanted to thank you so much, Aimé, for being with us today and explaining so thoroughly and so beautifully what your approach to the exhibition was, and for explaining the strategies behind your curatorial approach. It was excellent, and I think we all learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Maria Paula, and congratulations on your show. I wish I could have gone there to see it, and to go to Florida. I hope that things get better soon. But congratulations on your work, and I hope we have a chance to meet soon in person.
I hope so. So much. Thank you. And goodbye.
Bye-bye. Hugs.